In the desolate reaches of Upper Egypt, near the town of Nag Hammadi, a discovery was made in 1945 that would eventually pry open a forgotten chapter of early Christianity. It was an unassuming day when a local farmer, digging for fertilizer, unearthed a large red earthenware jar. Inside, protected from the relentless desert heat for nearly 16 centuries, lay a collection of ancient codices, bound in leather and written on papyrus. This wasn't merely a handful of scattered fragments. It was an entire library, meticulously preserved, revealing voices long silenced. Among these fragile texts, scholars would soon identify a document known as the Gospel of Mary, a text that presented Mary Magdalene not as a repentant sinner or a peripheral figure, but as an intimate disciple, a confidant of Jesus, and a recipient of profound spiritual teachings. The implications of this single find, slowly deciphered in the decades that followed, were nothing short of revolutionary, challenging centuries of established dogma and inviting us to reconsider everything we thought we knew about one of history's most pivotal women. The moment of discovery itself was raw and accidental, a stark contrast to the profound intellectual journey it would spark. Imagine the dry desert wind, the coarse sand sifting through fingers, the sudden clink of a shovel against ancient clay. The jar, sealed for so long, held not gold or jewels, but something far more precious: knowledge. As the leather-bound books were carefully extracted, their Coptic script, an ancient Egyptian language written with Greek letters, hinted at a world of thought that had flourished alongside, and perhaps even before, what became Orthodox Christianity. These were not the canonical Gospels we know today, but rather alternative narratives, distinct spiritual perspectives, deliberately hidden away, perhaps to protect them from destruction or simply to preserve a different vision of faith. This hidden library, a time capsule from the 4th century CE, spoke volumes not just through its content, but through the very act of its burial, suggesting a deliberate attempt to safeguard ideas deemed dangerous by emerging religious authorities. The painstaking process of translation and analysis would stretch over decades, slowly revealing the radical content of these forgotten scriptures. When the Gospel of Mary finally emerged into the light of modern scholarship, its message resonated with an almost defiant clarity. Here, Mary Magdalene is depicted engaging in deep spiritual dialogue with Jesus, receiving esoteric revelations that even some of the male apostles struggled to comprehend. She is presented not as a subordinate, but as a leader, a visionary, and an interpreter of profound truths. Peter, in one passage, expresses jealousy, questioning why Jesus loved her more than them. Such a portrayal stood in stark opposition to the prevailing image of Mary Magdalene, carefully crafted by centuries of institutional theology, that of a penitent prostitute, a lesser figure. These texts hinted at a vibrant, diverse early Christian movement where leadership and divine insight were not exclusively male, and where Mary Magdalene held a position of unparalleled spiritual authority. The existence of texts like the Gospel of Mary, deliberately suppressed and buried, forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth: that early Christianity was not a monolithic entity, but a complex tapestry of competing ideas and interpretations. The canonical narrative we inherited was the result of deliberate choices, of texts selected and others rejected, of voices amplified and others silenced. Why was this particular vision of Mary Magdalene, a vision of her as a potent spiritual leader and intimate confidant, deemed so threatening that it had to be erased from the historical record? What power did her voice hold that institutions felt compelled to mute it for 2 millennia? And what might her true story, now unearthed from the sands of Egypt, reveal about the very foundations of power, belief, and truth that continue to shape our world today? This is the journey we embark on, a search for the woman behind the legend, and the truths that institutions tried to bury. The discovery at Nag Hammadi was not an isolated event. It was a window into a world far more complex and contested than traditional narratives suggest. To truly understand why these texts were buried, we must journey back to the crucible of the Roman Empire, a vast and powerful civilization that dominated the Mediterranean world. From the deserts of Egypt to the bustling streets of Jerusalem, Roman authority was absolute. Yet beneath this veneer of imperial order, a vibrant tapestry of cultures, philosophies, and spiritual beliefs thrived. This was an era of profound intellectual and religious ferment, where Greek rationalism met Egyptian mysticism and Jewish messianism. It was within this melting pot, under the watchful eyes of Roman legions and local administrators, that a small radical movement would emerge, challenging both established religious practices and imperial power itself, setting the stage for centuries of conflict and suppression. The backdrop to early Christianity was the tumultuous landscape of Judea, a Roman province seething with political and religious tension. Within Judaism itself, diverse sects like the Pharisees, Sadducees, and Essenes offered varying interpretations of law, tradition, and the coming of the Messiah. The Essenes, for example, living in ascetic communities like Qumran near the Dead Sea, awaited a spiritual leader and a cosmic battle between light and darkness, their scrolls hinting at a rich, esoteric tradition. It was into this charged atmosphere of messianic expectation and Roman occupation that Jesus of Nazareth appeared, his teachings challenging the status quo and igniting a spiritual revolution. His message of personal transformation and a direct relationship with the divine resonated deeply, but it also sowed the seeds of division, both within Judaism and among his own followers, as different interpretations of his legacy began to take root even before his crucifixion. In the decades and centuries following Jesus' death, his followers spread his message across the Roman Empire, but their movement was far from monolithic. There was no single Christianity in the beginning. Instead, a multitude of communities emerged, each with distinct interpretations of Jesus' teachings, differing rituals, and varied leadership structures. Some emphasized an apocalyptic return, others a mystical union with the divine, and still others a radical social egalitarianism. Charismatic teachers and prophets guided these early groups, often drawing on a rich oral tradition before written gospels began to circulate. This vibrant diversity, evident in the multitude of texts like those found at Nag Hammadi, speaks to a dynamic and evolving faith. Yet it also presented a challenge. How could such a fragmented movement maintain cohesion and define its identity in a world increasingly hostile to its message? As the Christian movement grew, so did the imperative for structure and a unified doctrine. The need to present a cohesive front against external persecution and to resolve internal disputes over theological interpretation led to the gradual emergence of institutional authority. Bishops in major cities like Rome, Antioch, and Alexandria began to exert greater influence, organizing synods and councils to define what constituted orthodox belief and practice. This was a slow, deliberate process, often contentious, as various factions vied for influence and legitimacy. The very idea of heresy, a deviation from accepted doctrine, became a powerful tool in shaping the nascent church, allowing leaders to delineate boundaries and consolidate power by labeling dissenting voices as dangerous or misguided. Among these perceived threats was a diverse spiritual movement known broadly as Gnosticism, a term derived from the Greek word gnosis, meaning knowledge. Gnostics believed salvation came not through faith alone or adherence to dogma, but through a secret, intuitive knowledge of the divine, often revealed by a spiritual guide. Their texts, many of which were among the Nag Hammadi library, frequently portrayed a less patriarchal God, a more nuanced view of creation, and often prominent roles for women. The Gospel of Mary, with its depiction of Mary Magdalene as a recipient of profound esoteric teachings and a spiritual leader, aligns perfectly with this Gnostic worldview. This emphasis on individual direct revelation and secret knowledge, rather than the authority of a centralized institution and its clergy, posed a fundamental challenge to the emerging Orthodox Church, making its suppression almost inevitable. To counter these diverse interpretations and solidify a singular Christian identity, influential figures emerged who would become known as the Fathers of the Church. Men like Irenaeus of Lyons in the 2nd century, Tertullian in North Africa, and later Athanasius of Alexandria, systematically articulated what they considered to be the true faith, vigorously refuting what they labeled as heresies, particularly Gnosticism. They argued for a unified canon of Scripture, a standardized creed, and a hierarchical church structure. Their writings laid the groundwork for the New Testament as we know it today, carefully selecting texts that aligned with their vision of orthodoxy while rejecting others. This was not a purely theological exercise. It was a profound act of historical shaping, where certain voices were amplified and others, deemed dangerous or simply inconvenient, were systematically silenced and erased from the collective memory. The 4th century CE marked a pivotal turning point as the Roman Empire, under Emperor Constantine, shifted its stance towards Christianity. The Edict of Milan in 313 CE granted religious tolerance, and by the end of the century, Christianity would become the state religion of the Roman Empire. This alliance between imperial power and the institutional church dramatically accelerated the consolidation of orthodoxy. Emperors now had a vested interest in a unified church that could help maintain social order across their vast domains. Dissenting Christian movements, once merely theological opponents, became political liabilities, subject to the full weight of imperial law and persecution. The stakes were no longer just spiritual, they were geopolitical. And the official church, now backed by the most powerful empire in the world, gained unprecedented authority to enforce its doctrines. It is within this volatile crucible of theological debate, political maneuvering, and imperial decree that we can finally understand the desperate act that led to the Nag Hammadi discovery. As Orthodox Christianity, bolstered by Roman power, increasingly marginalized and condemned alternative interpretations, the communities holding texts like the Gospel of Mary faced a stark choice: conform, be destroyed, or hide. The act of burying an entire library of codices in the Egyptian desert was not an act of forgetfulness, but a deliberate, defiant attempt to preserve a different spiritual lineage. It was a silent rebellion against the forces of erasure, a desperate hope that one day these forgotten voices might resurface. These fragile papyri, hidden for centuries, are not merely historical relics. They are testaments to a profound struggle for control over truth, a struggle whose echoes still resonate in our modern world. For 2 millennia, the image of Mary Magdalene has been meticulously curated, her story woven into a tapestry of repentance and peripheral devotion, an archetype of a reformed sinner. Yet, in the desolate caves near Nag Hammadi, a discovery was made that tore through this carefully constructed veil, revealing not a repentant woman, but a formidable spiritual leader, a confidant of Jesus, and a recipient of profound esoteric teachings. The fragile papyri, hidden for 16 centuries, whisper a forbidden truth. Mary Magdalene was not merely a follower, but a crucial interpreter of Christ's message. Her voice so potent, so challenging to the emerging patriarchal structure, that it had to be systematically muted, her very identity reshaped by the hands of history. This was not an accidental omission, but a deliberate act of suppression, an institutional effort to rewrite the past and control the future of faith. Among the Nag Hammadi texts, the Gospel of Mary emerges as the most direct challenge to the Orthodox narrative. Here, we witness a Mary Magdalene who understands Jesus' teachings more deeply than many of his male disciples. The text depicts her receiving private revelations, sharing them with the other apostles, and even comforting them after Jesus' departure. She is portrayed as a visionary, a spiritual guide, someone privy to the secret things that Jesus taught. This isn't the Mary Magdalene of popular imagination. This is a woman of unparalleled spiritual authority, whose profound insight into the nature of reality and the divine soul placed her at the very heart of the early Christian movement. Her wisdom, as depicted in these ancient pages, was a direct conduit to gnosis, a secret knowledge that transcended mere belief. But this revelation did not come without contention. The Gospel of Mary explicitly records the friction among the disciples, a raw human struggle for leadership and understanding. Peter, the traditional cornerstone of the church, openly challenges Mary, questioning why Jesus would share profound wisdom with her, a woman, rather than with them. Did he really speak privately with her and not openly to us? Peter demands, his voice echoing across centuries, fraught with jealousy and disbelief. Andrew, too, expresses skepticism. This isn't merely a historical anecdote. It's a stark snapshot of the earliest power struggles within Christianity, a moment when the seeds of division were sown, not just over theological interpretation, but over who had the right to lead, to interpret, and to speak for the divine. The very nature of Mary Magdalene's authority, rooted in gnosis, a direct, intuitive spiritual knowledge, posed an existential threat to the emerging institutional church. If salvation came through personal insight and direct communion with the divine, as the Gnostics believed, what need was there for an intermediary priesthood, for sacraments, for a hierarchical structure? Her role as a vessel for esoteric truth bypassed the need for earthly authority, empowering individuals rather than institutions. This was a dangerous idea, one that undermined the very foundation upon which the Orthodox Church was building its power. The light of individual gnosis, piercing through the carefully constructed dogma, threatened to unravel the nascent ecclesiastical order. To counter this potent alternative, the institutional church embarked on a systematic campaign of erasure and redefinition. Mary Magdalene, the visionary, the confidant, was slowly transformed. The unnamed sinner from Luke's Gospel, the woman who anointed Jesus' feet, was conflated with Mary Magdalene, an act of deliberate theological revisionism that served to diminish her spiritual standing. She became a symbol not of profound insight, but of repentance, of a past life needing redemption. This calculated rebranding stripped her of her intellectual and spiritual authority, reducing her to a cautionary tale, a figure whose spiritual growth was contingent on her moral transformation, rather than her direct access to divine wisdom. The echoes of this deliberate misrepresentation still resonate today. The suppression of Mary Magdalene's true role was not an isolated incident. It was part of a broader, more pervasive effort to marginalize women's leadership within the burgeoning Christian movement. While Gnostic communities often saw women as spiritual equals, even leaders, the Orthodox Church gradually solidified a patriarchal structure. The voices of women prophets, teachers, and apostles, once active in early Christian communities, were systematically silenced, their contributions minimized or erased from the official record. Mary Magdalene's story thus becomes a microcosm of a much larger struggle, a testament to how the struggle for theological purity often intertwined with the desire for social and gender control, shaping the very fabric of what would become a male-dominated institution. As the Roman Empire embraced Christianity, lending its immense political and military power to the burgeoning church, the pressure to conform and consolidate doctrine became irresistible. Dissenting voices, once merely theological opponents, now risked becoming enemies of the state. The unified church, backed by imperial authority, had an unprecedented capacity to enforce its vision of truth. The dangerous truth, embodied by figures like Mary Magdalene and the Gnostic teaching she represented, was no longer just a spiritual threat. It was a political liability. The pursuit of a singular monolithic faith, deemed necessary for social order and imperial unity, became the driving force behind the systematic suppression of alternative Christianities, including the one where Mary Magdalene held such a prominent place. The act of burying the Nag Hammadi codices in the Egyptian desert was not a sign of defeat, but a desperate, defiant act of preservation. It was a silent rebellion against the forces of erasure, a desperate hope that one day these forgotten voices might resurface. Imagine the fear, the conviction, that drove those ancient believers to meticulously seal away their sacred texts, knowing that discovery meant destruction and adherence meant persecution. This wasn't accidental loss. It was a conscious decision to protect a different spiritual lineage, a deliberate attempt to safeguard ideas deemed heretical by the emerging orthodoxy. The dry sands of Egypt became a sanctuary for truths the powerful sought to bury, a testament to the enduring human spirit that resists absolute control over belief. The revelations from Nag Hammadi force us to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of truth itself. How much of what we accept as history, as doctrine, is merely the triumphant narrative of the powerful, carefully constructed to serve their interests? The story of Mary Magdalene's suppression is a stark reminder that history is not simply discovered. It is often created, edited, and controlled. This ancient struggle for narrative control echoes in our modern world, where information is power, and the battle to define reality is fought daily. Who decides what is true, what is false, what is amplified, and what is silenced? The sands of Egypt hold not just ancient texts, but a mirror reflecting our own contemporary struggles for authenticity and meaning. The rediscovery of Mary Magdalene's true voice, after centuries of forced silence, is more than an archaeological triumph. It is a profound reevaluation of faith, leadership, and the enduring human quest for spiritual understanding. Her story, now emerging from the shadows, challenges us to question received wisdom, to look beyond institutional narratives, and to seek the deeper truths that lie beneath layers of dogma and control. What does it mean for our understanding of divinity when the most profound revelations were once entrusted to a woman, only to be systematically erased? Her return from the forgotten corners of history invites us to reconsider the very foundations of power, belief, and truth, whispering a haunting question into the stillness of our modern world. Maybe the real mystery isn't what was written, but what was erased. The re-emergence of Mary Magdalene, not as a repentant sinner, but as a profound spiritual leader and intimate confidant of Jesus, shatters a carefully constructed narrative that has dominated Western thought for nearly 2 millennia. This isn't merely an academic footnote, it's a seismic shift, forcing us to reevaluate the very foundations of early Christian belief and the roles within it. If a figure so central to the narrative could be so fundamentally redefined, what does that say about the reliability of other historical accounts and the intentions behind their shaping? Her true story, now illuminated by the Nag Hammadi texts, challenges the institutionalization of faith, suggesting a radical alternative where direct spiritual experience, rather than hierarchical authority, was paramount. This revelation compels us to ask, how does this reframing of such a pivotal figure alter our understanding of divine revelation itself and the means by which humanity connects with the sacred? This radical portrayal directly undermines the patriarchal structures that solidified within the emerging Orthodox Church. The Gnostic texts, including the Gospel of Mary, reveal a spiritual landscape where women were not only present, but held positions of profound authority, teaching, and receiving esoteric knowledge. The deliberate suppression of Mary Magdalene's leadership, her transformation into a marginalized figure, wasn't an accidental oversight. It was a strategic move to establish a male-dominated clergy and consolidate power. This historical act of erasure sets a precedent, echoing through centuries of religious institutions where women's voices were systematically muted. The discovery now provides a blueprint for a more inclusive spiritual path that was deliberately buried, revealing a lost dimension of early Christian thought where gender was not a barrier to spiritual insight. The implications extend beyond gender, touching upon the very nature of truth and power. The case of Mary Magdalene serves as a stark historical lesson in how narratives are constructed, controlled, and weaponized by institutions to maintain authority. Her story is a prime example of historical revisionism, where the truth became what the powerful decreed it to be, effectively rewriting the past to shape the future of faith. This forces us to confront an uncomfortable reality. Much of what we accept as historical fact or religious doctrine is often the triumphant narrative of the victors, carefully curated to serve specific interests. If one such foundational truth was reshaped with such deliberate intent, it compels us to question what other foundational stones of history might be equally malleable, and how deeply this practice permeates our understanding of the past. The deliberate choice to exclude texts like the Gospel of Mary from the official biblical canon was a monumental act of historical shaping. As scholars like Elaine Pagels have meticulously documented, figures such as Irenaeus of Lyons actively campaigned against Gnostic writings in the 2nd century, labeling them as dangerous heresies. This wasn't merely a theological debate. It was a battle for the soul of Christianity, where the very definition of who Jesus was, what he taught, and who had the authority to interpret his message was at stake. The Church Fathers, in their zeal to create a unified doctrine, consciously selected texts that aligned with their vision of orthodoxy, while systematically rejecting and destroying those that offered alternative, often more egalitarian, interpretations. The formation of the biblical canon, therefore, was not just an act of preservation, but a profound and intentional act of exclusion. The spiritual consequence of this suppression is immense. By silencing voices like Mary Magdalene and burying the Gnostic texts, humanity was denied access to a richer, more diverse tapestry of early Christian thought. We lost not just alternative historical accounts, but distinct spiritual insights, mystical paths, and philosophical interpretations that could have profoundly shaped the course of Western spirituality. Imagine a Christianity where individual gnosis, direct, intuitive spiritual knowledge, was valued alongside communal faith, where the divine feminine held equal sway, and where leadership was based on spiritual insight rather than patriarchal lineage. The lost wisdom found at Nag Hammadi suggests that the path chosen by the Orthodox Church, while unifying, may have also impoverished human spiritual experience by narrowing its scope and limiting its potential for diverse expressions of faith. The ancient struggle for narrative control resonates powerfully in our modern world, where information is power, and the battle to define reality is fought daily across digital landscapes. Mary Magdalene's rediscovery becomes a potent symbol for all those who seek authenticity beyond institutional dogma, for those who yearn for a direct, unmediated spiritual experience. Her story empowers individuals to question inherited truths, to look beyond the official record, and to trust their own spiritual intuition. In an era grappling with disempowerment and the erosion of trust in traditional institutions, the reemergence of a figure whose authority stemmed from personal insight rather than ecclesiastical appointment offers a powerful challenge and a potential roadmap for reclaiming individual spiritual sovereignty. The long-term impact of suppressing Mary Magdalene's true role is evident in the millennia of gender inequality within religious institutions. Her demotion from spiritual leader to repentant sinner, created a template for marginalizing women's contributions and authority within organized religion. This ancient act of theological engineering cast a long shadow, influencing not only the church but also broader societal perceptions of women's roles and capabilities. Her reemergence now challenges contemporary religious structures that continue to limit women's leadership, demanding a re-examination of these deep-seated historical precedents. The return of Mary Magdalene, the apostle to the apostles, calls for a profound reconciliation with a past where women were central to the spiritual quest and a future where their voices are no longer silenced. Ultimately, the discovery at Nag Hammadi and the re-evaluation of Mary Magdalene's significance is more than an archaeological triumph. It is a profound philosophical and spiritual challenge. It forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of truth, the exercise of power, and the human desire to control belief. These ancient texts, unearthed from the sands of Egypt, are not just relics. They are living testimonies to a profound struggle for control over history and meaning, a struggle whose echoes still resonate in our search for authenticity today. They invite us to look beyond the surface, to question the narratives we've inherited, and to consider the profound implications of what was left out. The silent rebellion of those who buried these texts millennia ago has now become a clarion call, inviting us to rediscover a richer, more complex past and to forge a more honest spiritual future. The dust of Nag Hammadi may have settled, but the tremors from that discovery continue to reshape our understanding of history and faith in the modern era. The reemergence of Mary Magdalene, not as a repentant sinner, but as a profound spiritual leader, directly challenges the monolithic narratives that have shaped Western thought for 2 millennia. In a world grappling with information overload and the constant struggle to discern truth from fabrication, these ancient texts serve as a potent reminder. History is not merely a collection of facts, but a carefully constructed narrative, often curated by those in power. What does it mean for our contemporary search for meaning and authenticity to realize that even foundational religious stories were subject to deliberate editing, their alternative voices buried beneath centuries of dogma? This isn't just an academic debate. It's a visceral confrontation with the mechanisms of control, urging us to question the sources of our knowledge and to seek out the voices that were intentionally silenced. The implications resonate in every corner of our society, from theological inquiry to our understanding of gender roles, demanding a profound reevaluation of what we thought we knew. This journey through ancient deserts and forgotten archives ultimately reveals a profound truth about human nature, the enduring desire to control narratives, to shape the past in order to define the future. From the synods of early Christianity, where texts were selected and rejected, to the digital battlegrounds of today, where algorithms curate our reality, the struggle to define what is true, what is acceptable, and what is dangerous remains constant. We trace the faint outlines of this struggle in every carefully selected biblical passage, every discarded Gnostic codex, every rebranded historical figure like Mary Magdalene. The whispers of suppressed wisdom, now brought into the light, compel us to consider the vast, silent archives that exist beneath every official history, the untold stories that lie just beyond the accepted canon. It challenges us to look past the polished facades of established institutions and into the fragmented, often contradictory raw material of the past, understanding that history is not a static record, but a living, breathing entity, perpetually open to revision. For each of us, this story of Mary Magdalene and the Nag Hammadi texts becomes a profound personal invitation. It asks us to look inward, to question the inherited truths we hold dear, and to embrace the discomfort of uncertainty that often accompanies genuine discovery. If the foundations of our understanding of faith, leadership, and gender roles can be so dramatically reshaped by ancient papyri unearthed from the desert, what else might we be missing in our own lives, in our own histories? This isn't about discarding belief, but about deepening it, about moving beyond dogma to a more authentic, nuanced understanding of spiritual experience. Mary Magdalene's emphasis on direct, intuitive knowledge, gnosis, speaks to a primal hunger in our modern world for unmediated spiritual connection, for a faith that empowers the individual rather than simply dictating belief. It encourages us to become our own explorers, sifting through the layers of history and personal conviction, seeking the untamed wisdom that lies beyond the carefully constructed walls of institutions, trusting our own journey of revelation. The sands of Egypt guard many secrets, but they also reveal them, offering fleeting glimpses into a past far more complex and contested than we ever imagined. The rediscovery of Mary Magdalene's true voice, after centuries of deliberate silence, is more than an archaeological triumph. It is a profound testament to the enduring, irrepressible power of truth, even when buried, even when systematically suppressed for millennia. As the echoes of her story resonate across time, they compel us to look differently at the world around us, to listen for the whispers of other hidden histories, to question the silences in our narratives. They force us to consider the immense responsibility we bear, not just to uncover the past, but to critically examine the forces that shaped it, and to amplify the voices that were once muted. What other profound ideas, what other pivotal figures, what other radical possibilities were deemed too dangerous, too inconvenient, too challenging to be allowed to endure? The legacy of Nag Hammadi is not just what was found, but the haunting question it leaves behind, a question that lingers long after the final page is turned, or the last image fades from view, compelling us to forever ponder. Maybe the real mystery isn't what was written, but what was erased.